Okay, everybody, welcome to lecture 13, Orthodoxy in the Baltic provinces. So throughout this course, we've mostly dealt with orthodoxy on the pan-imperial general level. That is to say, we have looked at it on the most generalized kind of level, looking at policies, looking at religious behaviors overall, selected from certain examples occurring across the Russian Empire. But today we're going to have a look at how our themes intersect with themes in local history. And I think there is no better choice, given that I'm speaking from the University of Tartu in Estonia, than to talk about orthodoxy in what was Estland province, Livland province, and Kurland province, the Baltic provinces of the Russian Empire. And as we're going to see many of the themes that we've discussed over the course of this class repeat in the Baltic provinces, but while also interacting with particular local conditions. And of course, I will just repeat to make sure right now, is of course the Baltic provinces are a non-Russian, non-Orthodox borderland of the Russian Empire. The majority of the population are Estonian and Latvian speakers, and the majority religion is Lutheranism. Nonetheless, as we're going to see, Orthodoxy had a dynamic presence in the Baltic countries from especially from the middle of the 19th century, laying the groundwork for the creation of a substantial Orthodox minority in modern Estonia and modern Latvia, and also laying the groundwork for the creation of two new independent churches, the Estonian Orthodox Church and the Latvian Orthodox Church, both of which came to exist in the decades after the Russian Revolution in 1917. So then let's start with a bit of context then, looking at the Russian conquest of the Baltic region, what that meant for the local Baltic societies, especially in religious terms, and the early history of orthodoxy in the Baltic. So, as I'm sure many of you are aware, and indeed what we talked about in our first lecture, was that during the Great Northern War, Peter the Great conquered the Baltic provinces from Sweden. The Great Northern War started precisely as an alliance between Peter in Russia, Prussia, Denmark, and Poland to essentially take Sweden's European imperial provinces for themselves. Peter the Great's aim on entering into this conflict was to obtain a Baltic coastline for his new empire, primarily because he realized that that through this coastline he would be able to obtain more direct links, economic, social, and cultural, with Western Europe. And if you remember, Peter the Great is westernizing or modernizing the Russian Empire at this time. And so these kind of economic and cultural links with Western Europe are of considerable importance to him. And indeed, the Baltic provinces are well primed to play this role. They played host to two of Northern Europe's most important international port cities, Riga, primarily, but also Reval, or as it is called today, Tallinn. It should also be noted that these provinces were important for the grain that they produced. Their grain largely drove Sweden's military efforts. Sweden, of course, is a mostly mountainous country with very little arable, cultivatable land, whereas Estonia and Latvia are mostly flat, with a great deal of farmland producing a great deal of grain, which the Swedes used to support their wars, their rather substantial Northern European empire. And so, of course, taking this grain-producing region from the Swedes was of considerable strategic value to Peter. The initial Russian attempt to invade in 1700 goes badly wrong. The Russians are completely destroyed in the Battle of Narva in 1700. The battle is rather a spectacular affair where extremely large Russian army is holding a fortress in a snowstorm against a much smaller Swedish force. The much smaller Swedish force manages, despite the weather conditions, to take the fortress and drive the Russians back with extremely heavy losses. The French general, reportedly in command of the Russian army, went into shock and couldn't speak for several days. Such was the sort of scale and the unexpectedness of the defeat at Narva. And indeed, it is quite likely if Charles XII, the King of Sweden, had decided to pursue the Russian army at this point, he may have reached Moscow and, or at the very least, forced the Russians to reach a peace agreement that was favorable to him. But instead, Charles turned towards Poland and got involved in a civil war there for several years. The next major attempt came following the huge defeat of the Swedish field army at the Battle of Poltava in 1709. With the elimination of the Swedish field army, the Russian army now had essentially freedom to begin the conquest of Swedish forts throughout the Baltic, which is what they proceeded to do. And in 1710, the Russian army laid siege to both Riga and Tallinn, successfully conquering them, therefore bringing the Baltic provinces into the Russian Empire. Now, acquiring these new provinces, of course, posed problems of government. How were these provinces going to be ruled ruled by Russia? What would be the relationship with the local groups? Well, Peter essentially followed patterns already established in the sort of Russian patterns of imperial rule, essentially creating agreements with the local elites. The agreement being, we will preserve, you will be loyal to us, you will provide us with the things we request, particularly soldiers, particularly taxation, and in return we will preserve your religion, we will preserve your customs, we'll preserve your legal systems, we'll preserve your education, and you will have a degree of autonomy about how you govern this local region. And this is what occurs after the conquest of the Baltics in 1710. Peter essentially guarantees the ancient liberties and privileges of the Baltic German-speaking Lutheran elites, both landowning, commercial, and clerical, in the case of the Lutheran Church. And what do I mean when I say that Peter guarantees the liberties, the freedoms of the Lutheran Church? Well, he's basically assuring the local elites that he will not conduct forced conversions to Orthodoxy in the region. He will allow the Lutheran Church to continue to freely exist, so its churches, its priests will go unmolested by Russian state agents, and that its privileges in local law will remain intact. Now, I just want to make a few comments that are going to be relevant throughout this lecture about the social order of the Baltic states, both Estland, Livland, and Kurland in this period, in that they had been dominated since the Northern Crusades against the so-called pagan peoples of this region in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. They had been dominated by a German-speaking landed and clerical elite. When the Northern Crusaders came, they essentially took all the land that they could, established themselves as aristocrats, as landowners, and had lived in that position until, they essentially maintained that position until the revolution and the establishment of the independent Estonian and Latvian states between 1917 and 1920. The new states repossessed a lot of this land and redistributed it to Latvian and Estonian citizens away from these German-speaking peoples. But so for a period of about 700 years, there was a German landed elite in the Baltic states. And this is complemented by a commercial elite in the cities of Reval and Riga in particular. And their religion was Lutheran. In the late 16th century, the Reformation had landed in the Baltic states with a considerable splash. And by the end of the 17th century, there was very little remaining of any sort of Catholic presence in the region. In the south of Livland and in Kurland, there was still a relatively considerable Catholic population. And certainly there were Catholic cathedrals in places like Riga and Reval. But overall, the provinces had gone fully Lutheran. And especially because of Swedish influence, where Lutheranism was the established state religion of Sweden, this has certainly helped confirm the victory of the Reformation in this area. So I'm just going to give you, of course, it's necessary to give you an idea of the geography of these three provinces. So the first two provinces to enter the Russian Empire were Estland and Livland, following the conquest in 1710 and the confirmation of that conquest at the Treaty of Neustadt in 1721. These two provinces were joined by the province of Kurland, which was added to the Russian Empire following the third partition of Poland and Lithuania in 1795. Now these provinces look a little different to modern geography. I'm just going to show you some maps in a minute, but just to give you an oral explanation. The Estland province is not contiguous with modern Estonia. In fact, it largely only contained the north of modern Estonia. Livland province also was different from modern Latvia. It contained the southern parts of today's Estonia, the north and central parts of today's Latvia. Kurland province, in contrast, contained a very, relatively speaking, a narrow slice of what is today southern Latvia. So I'll just give you examples here in the maps. So here we see Estland province as it was in the 19th century. And I hope you can, for those of you who know the geography of Estonia, I hope most of my students here do. It'd be very disappointing if you didn't. You can see that this is much smaller than the modern Estonian state. Its border is much further north than the modern Estonian state. This is Livland province. As you can see again, so the capital here is Riga, as in modern Latvia, but unlike modern Latvia, its border is again much more northward. It contains a lot of Estonian speakers, and basically the southern border is along the river Daugava. And then we have the final province, which is Kurland province, what is today really a very tiny sliver of modern southern Latvia, of modern southern Latvia. although it also contained a tiny bit of what we would today consider modern Lithuania. And you can see, in fact, it borders on what was then Kovno province. Kovno today is the second city of Lithuania, and this explains why Catholicism was relatively prominent here compared to the rest of the Baltic states. So then, what about Orthodoxy's presence in the Baltic before the invasion of Peter the Great and their annexation to the Russian Empire? Well, there were some Orthodox churches in the region. I haven't yet seen any research detailing precisely how many. And some of this, of course, is based on sources which aren't entirely reliable. But there were certainly some, especially on where Estland and Livland bordered Russian majority provinces. So there were a few Russian settlers in the area who, of course, built churches, hired priests, and so on and so forth. By a much larger group, Russian Orthodox group in the region were, of course, the Old Believers. As you remember from a few lectures ago, the Old Believers, a group that had broken away from the official Russian Orthodox Church in the 1650s because of ritual reforms introduced by Patriarch Nikon. Their opposition to the Russian Orthodox Church had led to their persecution by both by state and ecclesiastical authorities in Russia, which increasingly drove them to flee either into the depths of Siberia or the depths of the Russian north or abroad. And many of them found a congenial home in the Baltic states. They were particularly large communities, and there remain communities around Lake Peipus in Estonia. And there was also very prominently the Grebenshikov community in the city of Riga. And I've given you here the population figure about the end of the 19th century for Estland. For Livland, there's about 3,000, the population figure is for the communities around Lake Peipus and around Tartu of about 3,000 Old Believers spread across 19 settlements, 19 villages. So the Old Believers constituted one of the largest presence of Russian Orthodoxy, but of course they didn't represent the Russian Orthodox Church or indeed the Russian state. They were essentially religious dissidents who had ended up in the area fleeing from persecution. Now during the 18th century, the Russian presence in the Baltic region is generally rather small. Not many Russians are settling in the Baltic provinces. Generally speaking, what we find, there are soldiers, Russian soldiers in the garrison towns. There are administrators in the major cities, in the major towns, and there are merchants, particularly those operating out of the international port cities of Riga and Tallinn. And this, of course, means that there are not many Orthodox churches in the region. About 24 or 25 by my count, by 1825. And these follow a general geographical pattern. The general places where we find these churches are major urban centers, so Riga, Tallinn, Tartu, Pärnu, a couple of other places, or we find them along the border with the Russian majority provinces of the empire. So that means essentially eastern Estonia, eastern Livland, eastern Kurland. There was also a monastery located in I have to say, by the way, just as a note to this lecture, I'm going to beg the pardon from Estonian and Latvian speakers, because undoubtedly I'm going to slaughter these pronunciations. So I beg your forgiveness. If anyone in the comments would like to correct me, please, I welcome that. But anyway, in Yakapils, in Russian, Yakovstadt, there was a Russian Orthodox monastery operating from about the end of the 17th century, where, as we're going to discuss later, it mostly took care of the miracle-working icon of the Jakobstadt Mother of God. But this was, generally speaking, by the 1820s, this was the position of Russian Orthodoxy in the Baltic provinces. A settler religion, mostly located in cities and on the borders with Russian majority provinces. I've given you, oh yes, of course, here we have some pictures. So this is of some of these churches founded in this early period. So here we have a parish founded very shortly after the Russian conquest in Paldiski, what was then known as Baltiski Port, and the current building dates to the end of the 19th century. Here we can see another example in Kulisar, what was then Arensburg, what was then in the imperial period Arensburg. Again, another a relatively large urban settlement based on one of the major islands of Estonia, with a fairly substantial Russian trading community. But just to give you some examples from the Old Believer architecture. So this is one Old Believer prayer house in Estonia. The building itself originates from much later in the 19th century, but there are records of the Old Believer community existing in this location in the middle of the 18th century. And then we have here a picture of the Glebenshikov prayer house in Riga, the site of one of the largest Old Believer communities outside of Russia proper. There was the first mention of an Old Believer prayer house existing there in the 1760s, although most of the buildings date from the end of the 18th and the first half of the 19th century. And you can this is still a major site today in the center of Riga. There is a street in Riga's old town named after this Old Believer community, and you can go and visit it if you are so inclined, or if you have the opportunity after travel restrictions have been lifted. But anyway, so that's the situation of Orthodoxy in the Baltic states at the beginning of the 19th century. And it's not too different from the situation in many other borderland areas of the Russian Empire. There's very few churches, generally located in cities, in large towns, in commercial centers, or in areas which border the Russian Empire, which border Russian majority provinces. However, there are events that take place in Estland, Livland, and Courland in the 19th century which radically transform the fate of Orthodoxy in the Baltic region. And we're going to approach these events now. But we should understand before getting onto these properly that these events were underwritten by certain socio-economic trends within Baltic society. As I mentioned, the leading landed and commercial elite in the Baltic region were German aristocrats and German merchants. And these German aristocrats essentially had serf estates, where the serfs were Estonian and Latvian speakers, much as in Russia proper, where Russian landlords had estates whose major economic workforce were Russian serfs. However, there was a distinction, And that was the fact that serfdom in the Baltic provinces was abolished much, much earlier than in the rest of the Russian Empire. As you may recall, in the rest of the Russian Empire, serfdom is abolished in 1861 by Alexander II. However, serfdom is abolished in the Baltic states between 1816 and 1819. And this is regarded by the relatively reforming government of Alexander I to be almost a test, a case, a trial run for what the abolition of serfdom might look like if it's enacted in Russia. However, it was not a particularly good trial run, and the reason is because the abolition of serfdom in the Baltic states mostly leaves the privileges of a German-speaking landlords intact, and indeed worsens the conditions of the Estonian and Latvian-speaking peasantry. For instance, even though they were now technically free peasants, they still had to seek the permission of their landlords to leave the estate. They still had to seek permission to marry, and they still had to provide labor services to their landlords free of charge. So that remained the same. But unlike when they were serfs, they couldn't technically, legally, be thrown off their land. They were connected to the land legally. However, now they were free peasants, they became tenants, they became renters. And that meant their holding of the land was dependent on contracts with the landlord. And the landlord could end those contracts, or when those contracts came to the end of their lives, simply remove those peasants and employ someone who would have, for instance, would pay more rent or would be a more productive individual. So in many cases, it made the economic life of the Estonian and Latvian peasantries more insecure. They essentially became a class of landless labourers, dependent almost entirely on rental agreements with German landowning aristocracy. Meanwhile, other changes were going on within the empire. Nicholas I, coming to power in the midst of the Decembrist revolt against the imperial autocracy, sought to secure his regime, to secure his own rule, through a process of administrative uniformization. Basically attempting to try and bring these previously autonomous legal arrangements, administrative arrangements, under one umbrella, under the control of his centralizing Russian state. And of course, this challenged some of the privileges that had been given to the Baltic German elite by Peter the Great. And one area where this was very conspicuous in religious terms was the changes to the legal position of the Lutheran Church. Previously, the Lutheran Church in the Baltic states had been autonomous, governed by its own administrative organs located in the major capitals of the Baltic states. Now they were under a new law released in 1832. They were brought under the control of a general Lutheran consistory in St. Petersburg, which ran not only the Lutheran churches in the Baltic provinces, but indeed Lutheran churches across the entirety of the empire. And it should be noted that that body in itself was responsible to a secular organ of the Russian state, the so-called departments for foreign confessions or foreign faiths, which was a department within the Ministry of Internal Affairs. So for all intensive purposes then, the Lutheran Church in the Baltic states has become subordinated to a secular institution within the Russian central government. And this meant increased secular intervention by the Russian state in the affairs of the Lutheran Church. More controls on what they did, on how they behaved, on how they administered their believers. So, for instance, I've given you two examples here. Is that now Lutheran Church had to get permission for marrying mixed confessional couples from the Department for Foreign Confessions, and they also had to get permission to publish religious literature. These were actually not too different from the controls which were imposed on the Russian Orthodox Church, and indeed most of the other foreign faiths the so-called foreign faiths working in the Russian Empire also had similar kind of conditions imposed upon them. But this did mark a new step, a new level of state intervention in the affairs, firstly of the Lutheran Church, but also in the affairs of the Lutheran German elites that administered and controlled the Baltic provinces. Now, as we discussed in a previous lecture, Nicholas's reign was characterized by two offenses, two major offensives against non-Orthodox religions. And these two religions were Old Belief and the Uniate, the Greco-Catholic Church, located mostly in modern Poland, modern Ukraine. Nicholas's animosity towards Old Belief was driven by the fact that he interpreted their rejection of the Orthodox Church, firstly, the official Orthodox Church, firstly as a refusal to be loyal to him personally and to be loyal to the Russian state and the Russian government. And he also regarded it as an act of almost civil disobedience, a refusal to come under the administrative structures of the Orthodox Church and therefore to be countered and administered by the rest of the Russian state. This meant his reign saw an unprecedented attack against the Old Believers, the exile or imprisonment of many of their priests and other religious officiants, the closure of Old Believer churches, prayer houses, monasteries, the burning and seizure of Old Believer books on a massive scale, forced conversions or pressured conversions to Orthodoxy throughout the empire. And in this case, the Baltic was no exception. As I mentioned, the Baltic had played host to a rather large Old Believer community from the beginning of the 18th century, one which had only grown in size, scope, and influence by the beginning of the 19th century. It had profited in particular from the relative toleration given during the reigns of Catherine the Great and her grandson Alexander I. This was now changed as Nicholas begins to intervene in an unprecedented way in the religious lives of the Baltic's Old Believers and trying to pressure them essentially to convert to Orthodoxy. The first major attack comes with the closure of the Glavenchikov community's schools in 1832. At the same time, to support this effort, the Russian Orthodox Church starts deploying an increased number of missionaries in the Baltic provinces, deliberately aiming their efforts at pressuring, converting the Old Believers, often with the assistance of local police and the local administration. Now, this campaign against Old Belief, in fact, led to the establishment of of new institutional forms of orthodoxy in the Baltic region. Before this campaign starts in the 1830s, the institutional presence of the Russian Orthodox Church in the region had been quite weak. After all, there was only a very small handful of churches, a very small number of priests, a very small number of believers to administer. For instance, so basically the Livland province had been governed, the churches of Livland province had been governed by an ecclesiastical board, which was in turn responsible to the Diocese of Pskov. A suffragancy, that is the position of a vicar bishop, an assistant bishop, had been established in Reval, in Tallinn, in 1817. But most of the bishops who attended there had very short stays, and it was largely regarded as being a way to keep politically important bishops or potentially useful bishops close to St. Petersburg. After all, Reval was relatively accessible from St. Petersburg, meaning that these bishops would have access to the synod, access to the imperial court, the circles of the higher society circles in St. Petersburg. So the bishops who sat in, the suffragan bishops who went to Reval, usually it was largely treated as a stepping stone to a future career. Most of them did not sit there for very long. Most of them certainly did not become acquainted with the diocese they were supposed to manage, especially since the diocese largely consisted of a very small handful of Russian Orthodox churches, a very small handful of priests. Now, with the offensive against the old belief, this changes, because now there is an Orthodox mission active in the territories of Estland, Livland, and Courland. And this means that these missions need to be administered. And any successes, any people they get to convert, any new churches founded, as a result of that conversion, need to be administered. And so in 1836, Nicholas I orders the creation of the Riga suffragancy. This still meant that the Riga bishop, the suffragan bishop of Riga, was still subordinated to the diocesan bishop of Pskov, but it was an unprecedented step in the institutionalization of this region, especially since these bishops, unlike their equivalents in Reval and Tallinn, largely remained in place and largely were expected to deal with the local issues emerging from this new branch of the Russian Orthodox Church. And here I've given you a picture of the first suffragan bishop of Riga, Irinach Popov. He's going to be quite an important figure for what we're going to discuss next. So at the moment, really, the structure, by the creation of the Riga suffragancy, Orthodoxy's position hasn't changed, particularly in the Russian the position of Orthodoxy in the Riga diocese, in the new Riga diocese, hasn't changed. Orthodoxy is still a very small faith, still populated by very few believers, still with very few churches. Even with the missionary activities against the old believers, there aren't, as we stated, they don't have much success in these missionary efforts. What changes the character of Orthodoxy are the events of the 1840s. Now, we already mentioned that essentially the consequence of the emancipation of the serfs in the Baltic region had been to create a largely impoverished, landless agricultural class that was particularly vulnerable to economic downturns, to bad harvests, to shortages, and to other misfortune. And indeed, the late 1830s, the early 1840s, indeed saw such an economic downturn, both in the Baltic state and indeed in general throughout the rest of Europe. There were, in the Baltic provinces in particular, 1841, 1842, there was a shortage of grain because of a bad harvest. and this made what was already quite a bad situation for the Baltic peasantries rather desperate. At the time, in the Russian Empire, the southern provinces of that empire were rather underpopulated. And a lot of rumours were spreading that the Russian government would support the resettlement of peoples into these warmer provinces with their much more fertile land. Therefore, large groups of Estonian and Latvian peasants turned to the regional governments in the region, requesting permission to resettle to these other regions. From the secular officials in the Baltic states, they received refusal. They regarded the movement of such large numbers of people would be economically devastating for the Baltic region and would also pose problems, challenges to civil order and civil peace, and might potentially cause unrest. So they were refused. Of course, these Estonian and Latvian peasants quite well understood, but there were a multiplicity of state agents in the Baltic, and they understood that the new Russian Orthodox Bishop of Riga was precisely a representative of the Russian state. And so they decided to try and turn to him for support. And unlike the secular representatives, who simply turned away the peasant petitions, Irina actually accepted them and submitted them forward to the central state. And this got to many of the peasants thinking that a conversion to Orthodoxy could be a way of procuring not only the support of the Russian Orthodox Church, but also of the Russian imperial state, of gaining intervention from the Russian imperial state in their socio-economic struggles with the landed German aristocracy. Now, Irina was being a bit of a rebel, indeed, by accepting these proposals. He had received instructions and advice not only from the local administration, from the governor, but also from the Holy Synod in St. Petersburg and some of the ministries in St. Petersburg, not to accept these requests for conversion, or at the very least to be extremely cautious about accepting them. Irina actually just ignored these and went ahead and continued accepting requests upon accepting these requests. Obviously, he was no doubt anxious, I think, to create a more substantial Orthodox church in the region. And I'm sure after sort of a decade of unsuccessful missionary activities against the old believers, he was quite glad to see, well, at least in one area, the church was having influence and attracting people from a different faith. However, the local government, the German-dominated local government, especially the governor of the Baltic provinces, Van der Pelen, were outraged that Irina behaved in this way, accepted these petitions. On the one hand, they regarded this as Irina encouraging civil disorder, encouraging acts of civil disobedience among the peasants. On the other hand, I'm sure they were quite aware that bringing the peasants under the Orthodox Church would encourage Russian intervention from the Russian central state into Baltic affairs, and would also, in loosening Lutheran control over these converts, they themselves would lose one of their key sort of tools for controlling the local peasantry. Because of this conflict, Ilinak was removed in 1841, sent to a different province. He complained bitterly until the end of his life that the removal was unjust, that he'd been removed for simply serving Orthodoxy and for serving the Russian state, but nonetheless he was certainly disciplined and replaced by a far more moderate clergyman, Fyodor Gumilevsky, who certainly did not clash with the local German administration as much as Ilinak had. However, there were also changes going on within Nicholas I's government, within Nicholas I's outlook, which led to changes in personnel shortly after Ilinak's departure from the Baltic. Instead of appointing Baltic Germans both to provincial offices and in the central ministries of the Russian state, Nicholas began to appoint Russian Orthodox people who had far more sympathy towards the cause of the Russian Orthodox Church in this province. I've given you a picture here of the Russian governor appointed after Van der Palen's removal, Yevgeny Galevin. And certainly the church begins to realize that this is now a potentially fruitful missionary field for their future endeavors. The seminary in Pskov, for instance, starts to offer courses to those training to be priests in Estonian, in Latvian, in preparation for dispatch to these provinces where they can work as first to convert people and then to head the parishes of these converts. In the midst of these changes, the second wave of mass conversions occurs. And this one is on a much, much bigger scale than the one which occurred in 1841, 1842. Between 1845 and 1848, 110,000, approximately, 110,000 Estonians and Latvians convert to Russian Orthodoxy. This is a huge proportion of the population of the Baltic states. And on this occasion, they found a Russian state that was much more receptive to ignoring the complaints of the local German nobility, of the local German Lutheran clergy, and to accepting these individuals into Orthodoxy. Of course, however, the church was instructed to be cautious. They were told to tell these converts, you will not receive any material benefits for converting to Orthodoxy. You will not be given land, you will not be given money, you will not be relieved of taxation burdens, you will not be relieved of a duty to be obedient to your landlord, etc., etc. In other words, the church was trying to ensure that these people were converting not for material reasons, but out of sincerity of faith. Of course, as we're going to see, this was quite questionable. But anyway, the church certainly tried to take these steps to guarantee a degree of sincerity from the converts. On the other hand, the Orthodox Church launched a long-standing narrative that it maintained until the Russian Revolution in 1917 was about how the Russian Lutheran clergy and the Russian landowning estates were implacably opposed to the cause of the Russian Orthodox Church and were doing everything in their power to stop the spread of Russian Orthodoxy. For instance, it was frequently claimed that German landowners were threatening converts, were being thrown off their land, they were being threatened with fines, they were being threatened with physical punishments for conversion. They were being barred from attending the Orthodox churches. Orthodox priests were being forbidden from visiting potential converts or people who had already converted, and so on and so forth. There is some truth to this, but again, to a large extent, it is an image, a rhetorical device deployed by the Russian Orthodox Church to claim that its interests are under threat, and therefore to attempt to bring the intervention of the Russian state onto its side, and therefore onto the side of the new converts. Now I've given you here an example of one such convert, an Estonian, Juhan Levenson, converting in December 1845. I'll give you this example because I would like to sort of show you what were the thinking processes, as far as we can know, of one of these people, one of these, very average, very normal, with very little education. What was their thinking process when they turned away from the Lutheran Church, which had been their faith since birth, which had been the faith of their fathers and grandfathers? What was their thinking process when they turned to receive Russian Orthodoxy? So if you don't mind, I'll just read these out to you, sort of give you a feel of what was going on in the minds of these converts. So Levenson, being interrogated here by Russian bureaucrats. So the question why I had come to the local Orthodox Church, I said that I want to convert to God and the Tsar. After this, the priest, taking my passport, with which I had travelled to Petersburg, wrote my name in a book and asked me whether I was converting so as not to serve my landlord. And when I said no, the priest, anointing me, placed a moist cloth on my head and then giving me a cross, said something, but I understood nothing. And I did not notice whatever rituals were formed during the baptism out of fear. Who exactly baptized me? I do not know. During the baptism, there was an official. After the baptism, the priest made a notation in the passport. So here we see this individual clearly has very little understanding of the religious ceremonies he's undergoing to join Orthodoxy. And he precisely regards joining Orthodoxy, he says here, converting to the Tsar. Converting, in other words, to the imperial ruler's faith. It is understood, Orthodoxy here is being understood not as rituals or as convictions, but as a state religion which might bring in the favour of that state on the side of Estonian peasants, like Levenson. And here I give you a second quotation which tells you precisely how Levenson discussed his conversion with others. In many taverns where there was a crowd of people, I heard, but from whom I don't exactly remember, that the Tsar wishes conversion to Orthodoxy, that in Livland it is only permitted to convert until the 1st of January 1846, and that whoever converts will be given 3 silver rubles, 3 measures of land, and that the publication of the Governor-General, nothing will be given for conversion, is untrue, and is issued because the landlords do not desire the conversions. But I did not spread such rumours. While Thomas Tazan, having learned I converted to Orthodoxy, asked whether I received anything for this, I answered that I received nothing. And then during the conversation I said, entirely as a joke, that for conversion to Orthodoxy they will give each person 3 silver rubles and 3 measures of land. But whether I said that a deadline had been set for conversion and that the patent of the Governor-General is false, I don't remember. I spoke no more about benefits of conversion with anybody else. And so here we see the government sphere, precisely that the government sphere and the church's sphere, that this conversion is being encouraged by rumours of material benefits. This individual is being accused of spreading rumours that people will receive money and land if they convert to Orthodoxy. He himself says that he heard rumours in taverns that people would gain land and money if they converted to Orthodoxy. And again we see this being framed in a language of loyalty to the state. They believe the idea of at least loyalty to the Tsar. That conversion was what the Tsar wanted, and that by converting, they were manifesting their loyalty to the Tsar. Although, interestingly, he shows that many of these rumours disbelieved the letters from the Governor-General, which stated that there would be no material benefits for conversion. So what were the results? Well, unsurprisingly, this means there is a massive expansion of Orthodox believers in the Baltics, and it also means an expansion of the church network in the Baltic, of the number of parishes in the Baltics. Now I'm going to show you a couple of maps in a second, which will make visually clear how dramatic this change was. I've given you the numbers here, at least according to my accounting. There may be some errors here. A second consequence was that the institutionalization of Baltic Orthodoxy went a step further. In 1850, in other words, at the very end of this mass conversions, the Riga suffragancy was turned into a fully independent diocese. That meant it now had the prestige and the institutions and the administration of other independent dioceses in the region. So it gained a seminary, it gained a consistory, it gained all of these kind of other organs we've discussed throughout the rest of this course, used by the clergy and other individuals for the administration of the church in this region. And it should be mentioned, it immediately was recognized in this new seminary, which first held its lessons in 1851, but there was going to be a need now for Latvian and Estonian speaking clergymen, especially if they came from among the converts themselves. And so the courses being offered in this new seminary were unique in the Russian Empire in that they were offered in 3 different languages: Estonian, Latvian, and Russian. However, of course, this amount of conversions creates serious problems for the Russian Orthodox Church. One thing is that these converts are not from the social elites of local society. They're from the poorest group, the landless peasantry. These people don't have much money or land to give to priests or to provide a space for the building of a church, for the building of a school, and so on and so forth. Then, of course, there are language problems. At the very beginning, there are very few priests in the Russian Empire who speak Estonian or Latvian. Equally, there's not been much effort in translating key Orthodox religious texts into either Estonian or Latvian. Now, in the case of translating texts, this changes rather quickly, and they do have a very large sort of translation effort that continues throughout the century in trying to provide as much Orthodox religious material in Estonian and Latvian as possible. But certainly at this starting point, there is very little to help priests give the key religious services in the local languages. And finally, the church itself, the central church, the synod, did not really possess the funds to build all the new churches that were required for all of these new convert parishes. This meant, in turn, that there was no real appropriate buildings to host these new converts. Often the new churches were simply peasant homes, where the peasant had permitted the priest to perform religious ceremonies. And you can see why this is a problem. Not only is, it doesn't give the Russian Orthodoxy a prestigious image. Comparatively speaking, you have in these villages a Lutheran church, perhaps decades, perhaps centuries old, made of wood or stone, compared to Orthodoxy, the Orthodox Church being conducted in a sort of peasant hut. It doesn't look good either to external observers or to these new converts themselves. So here is this map. So the orange points you can see here are the parishes that existed, the churches that existed in up to 1825, about 24 or 25 of them. And now you see what has happened by 1860, a massive transformation. And again, we can see these parishes are not just located in major cities and towns, but they are located in countryside, in the countryside, in places where Orthodoxy had never really touched before. So this is a radical transformation of religious space and the religious character of the Baltic provinces between 1840 and 1860. Now, these problems I just mentioned, lack of churches, lack of Estonian, Latvian-speaking priests, lack of Estonian, Latvian religious materials, of course, begin to persuade some of these converts that they had made the wrong choice. And especially when we think many of these individuals had converted because they expected increased state intervention on their behalf. Some had done so directly because they thought material benefits were available, but many had expected that the state would intervene on their behalf in their struggle both to survive and their struggle with the German Lutheran elite. Well, this did not really happen, especially in the 1850s, when Nicholas I confirms his support for the Lutheran landowning aristocracy in the face of the revolutions going on in the rest of Europe. So increasingly, throughout the 1850s, we find cases occurring again and again when these converts were petitioning, asking to return to Lutheranism, or just very simply not attending Russian Orthodox religious ceremonies and going to the Lutheran priest without permission. And the problem with this was that this was considered apostasy. This was considered converting away from Orthodoxy to Lutheranism. And apostasy was forbidden under the Russian imperial law. Furthermore, it was required that Orthodox believers had to take the confession and the Eucharist at least once a year. And by not doing so in an Orthodox church, these individuals were violating a key state law. In 1864, after various inspections and requests for information from the bishop at the time, Platon Golodetsky, it becomes clear that Orthodoxy is in serious problems among at least some of these convert communities. I give you here the example of Aidru. Sorry, I beg you again, sorry for the pronunciation, but that's a picture of the Aidru church, parish church in the, that you can see there. The overwhelming majority of parishioners, when asked, wanted to return to Lutheranism. 1,439 of 1,923 parishioners in the Orthodox parish wanted to return to the Lutheran Church. One of the Russian inspectors, Bobrinsky, reported that barely 1 in 10 Estonian and Latvian Orthodox wanted to remain in the Orthodox Church. And the response of the state at this point, despite the complaints of Bishop Platon and others, is to essentially decide that they're going to ignore this behavior. They won't enforce the laws against apostasy. They won't punish Lutheran priests for baptizing the children of these allegedly Orthodox individuals. They won't punish the Lutheran priests for conducting marriages for these individuals, and so on and so forth. In other words, the state decides, for the sake of civil order, to not enforce its own apostasy laws. Of course, this is not official, and it's never stated officially, but this is what is going on behind the scenes. This is the secret instructions given is basically, well, it can be ignored. This brings an end to the sort of first major transformation of Baltic Orthodoxy, with an increasing sense of crisis in the 1860s due to large-scale apostasy and large-scale disinterest in Orthodox Church from among its new converts. A new stage begins in the 1880s, when the Russian state becomes far, far less interested in protecting and preserving the privileges of the Baltic Germans, and far, far more invested in advancing the cause both of the Russian Orthodox Church, the Russian language, and Russian culture in the Baltic provinces. In other words, when the Baltic provinces begin to be Russified by the government. So just to recap, Russification, what is it and why does it occur? So as we discussed at the beginning of this lecture, the Russian government's traditional approach to managing its empire had been largely to allow local elites to maintain their traditions, their customs, their religion, their language, their local forms of administration in exchange for loyalty, in exchange for taxation, in exchange for soldiers, and so on and so forth. This system sustains a severe crisis in the early 1860s when the Polish nobility lead a large rebellion against the Russian Orthodox state, against the Russian state, attempting to re-establish an independent kingdom of Poland. Led by Polish Catholic nobility and Polish Catholic clergy, this rebellion makes it clear to the Russian government that the idea that they can rely on local elites to attach these provinces, non-Russian provinces to the empire is a wrong idea. This is also an era of rising nationalism, national thinking in Russia and elsewhere. And so the alternative to this system, to this old system of managing empire, is instead to gain the loyalty of the population by Russifying them, by increasingly turning towards Russian language, Russian culture, by placing them directly under Russian forms of administration, and if possible, by getting them to believe, subscribe to the Russian faith, the Orthodox Church. And increasingly, the elites which the Russian state had previously relied on are framed by national ideologists, both within the government and outside it, as fundamentally disloyal factors in the Russian Empire, as people who are fundamentally disloyal and opposed to the cause of the Russian state, to the Russian government, and to Russian culture. Now this process begins, Russification begins, especially of course, in the heartlands of the rebellion, in Poland and Lithuania and parts of Ukraine, in the 1860s and 1870s. However, it takes, it's only with the death of Alexander II, when he was assassinated in 1881, that Russification elsewhere receives a huge impetus. And this is because the new Tsar, Alexander III, the son of Alexander II, was a huge Russian nationalist, a huge supporter of a Slavophile notion of Russian nationalism. And he promoted Russian nationalists and people interested in the cause of Russification, both within the central government itself and also within the provinces. We've met one of these individuals before, the Old Procurator of the Holy Synod, Konstantin Pobedonosov, was a strong supporter of measures of Russification and measures against non-Orthodox religions. In the Baltic, Russification is mostly undertaken by this gentleman, Prince Sergei Chkhovskoy, a close friend and ally of Pobedonosov, and he was in the Baltic state, in the governor of Estland from 1885 to 1894. He was called a man of Rurik's blood on the on Russia's Baltic coast. In other words, a strong Russian nationalist serving the ancient Russian cause on the Baltic coasts. And I've given you here basically a sort of list of what Russification entailed in the Baltic in administrative, educational, legal, and other terms, and in educational terms. So we see in 1885, Russian becomes the obligatory language of, it says education, it doesn't say administration. In 1889, it becomes the language of municipal administration. The traditional Baltic court system, preserved from the medieval period, which operated in terms of German law, was abolished and replaced with the Russian court system. In 1888, the Russian police system, itself very far from perfect, was also introduced. Russian becomes the main language of education in the 1890s. One of the most striking instances of Russification in the Baltic was that Dorpat, today Tartu, was given a new Russian name of Yurev, and the world-famous university from which I was speaking was compelled to teach in Russian, the only exception being the Theology department, which was allowed to continue its traditional tuition in German. And I want to emphasize something here, is that this Russification is not really aimed at Estonians and Latvians. It's not really aimed at the Estonian language or the Latvian language. What it's aimed at is weakening the social, economic, cultural, and administrative control of the German elite. Chkhovskoy, when he talks about Estonians and Latvians in his letters, largely regards them as a non-cultured people. In other words, the Estonians and Latvians are the subjects of a competition, in his mind, between German civilization and Russian civilization. And by weakening German civilization in the Baltic provinces, Chkhovskoy seeks to claim Estonians and Latvians in the name of Russian civilization. In fact, in some ways, even Chkhovskoy sponsors certain Estonian-speaking developments. For instance, he certainly sponsors, he very much supports the idea of recreating the suffragancy of Revel, recreating a suffragan bishop in Revel, and he was very much in favor of having an Estonian priest appointed to that position. And that priest would be there in charge of precisely giving out religious services and religious sermons in Estonian. So in some cases, a Russifier could sponsor Estonian or Latvian in this region. The increased government intervention in the Baltic states made it again clear to the peasantry that the state might be willing to intervene on their behalf. And once again, some of them considered that a way of attaining that support might be to convert to Russian Orthodoxy. And so, again, we see another wave of conversions, much smaller than the first, but still a considerable number in a relatively short space of time. Between 1883 and 1887, 4 years, over 15,000, mostly Estonians, but also some Latvians, convert to Russian Orthodoxy. And this time, the state takes even more active measures to support these converts and support their new priests. In 1886, the state passes a truly landmark piece of legislation, which allows the alienation, in other words, the seizure of private land from Lutheran German aristocratic owners to be given to the Orthodox Church in order to support the priests for the construction of a church building, etc., etc. Now, of course, it wasn't a terribly large piece of land that they were allowed to alienate. But for the Russian state, it was a remarkable departure, because generally speaking, the Russian imperial state did guarantee the right to own property as inviolable in this late imperial period. So to essentially state that the church can, with the state support, alienate, seize land from a private owner is quite a substantial mark of how far they were willing to go to support the Russian Orthodox Church's interests in the Baltic states. In 1885, the stance that had existed since 1865 ceased. The state stopped allowing people to ignore the apostasy laws, the laws against trying to convert others. This meant now that any children who had been baptized, born of Orthodox parents, but who had been baptized in a Lutheran church by a Lutheran priest, were automatically considered as Orthodox. Anybody who'd been married by a Lutheran priest were told to get remarried by an Orthodox priest, and so on and so forth. But the truly tragic consequences came for the Lutheran clergy. Now, of course, they'd been basically operating for the past 20 years, conducting baptisms, marriages, funerals, other religious ceremonies for these Orthodox converts, these people who had converted from Orthodoxy and were not, but yet still wanted to return to Lutheranism. Because the law was now being strictly applied in 1885, these people were considered these priests, these clergy, these Lutheran clergy, were considered to be people who had been willingly tempting Orthodox believers into Lutheranism by their actions. And this was strictly an offence that could bear extremely harsh punishments. And in the decade between 1884 and 1894, 129 Lutheran pastors from the Baltic region are arrested and put on trial for supposedly tempting Orthodox parishioners to convert to Lutheranism in the Baltic state. This is a considerable proportion of the entire number of Lutheran priests in the region. What essentially stops this process is the massive international outcry that goes on in the European press, especially in the German-speaking European press. Across the German-speaking European press, numerous articles and campaigns were launched claiming that the tyrannical Imperial Russian regime was repressing and persecuting Lutheranism, and German speakers unjustly, unfairly, and without due process. A major stage in this came when Hermann Dalton, the long-standing Lutheran pastor of one of St. Petersburg's main Lutheran churches, wrote a public letter to Pope Alexander condemning the lack of freedom of religion in the Russian Empire. And this public letter was rapidly translated into multiple languages across Europe and widely printed in a large number of newspapers in many European countries. Ironically, Dalton had actually been a relatively good friend of Pope Alexander up until this point. The scandal grew to such an extent that it even started to affect Alexander I's diplomacy when he went to visit his relative, the King of Denmark, in Copenhagen, the King of Denmark brought out a copy of the pamphlet and asked Alexander to explain it. Deeply embarrassing bizarre. And this led to, essentially, in 1894, the discontinuation of this prosecution of the majority of the Baltic states' Lutheran clergy. So here we can see again, we go back to our map of how much of the spread of Orthodoxy. So here you see the situation by 1880, at the beginning, just by 1880. So we've already seen the orange ones are the churches founded in 1825. The green ones were the churches founded between 1825 and 1860, and the purple ones are the churches founded between 1860 and 1880. This latter category, the purple ones, of course, occurs in this period of apostasy, and so we can see there is actually very, very limited growth in Orthodox parishes in this period. And now we can see what happens in the period 1880 to 1890, with churches in the blue circles. And here we can see again a considerable number of parish foundations, especially in Estonian-speaking parts of the Baltic provinces. The church was eager not to make the same mistakes that had almost ruined the conversions in the 1840s. In other words, the church was eager to make sure that there could be well-trained priests who spoke local languages, and that churches would be available to them, would be available to these new convert parishes very shortly after their creation. Arseny Bryanzev, the Archbishop of Riga in this period, was an extremely energetic individual who absolutely sought to ensure that churches were built in these new convert parishes as quickly as possible. And he wasn't the only one who was conscious of the fact that they needed churches, priests, and schools in these new parishes as quickly as possible. The state, the synod, and a variety of other high-ranking government ministers, and Prince Shahovskoy, the governor, were aware that they needed to, that a church building program needed to be launched. For the parishes formed between 1845 and 1848, a wait of up to 2 decades, up to 20 years, was not unheard of for the building of a new church. Although most had it within 10 years, a wooden building, at least a wooden building within 10 years. In the case, in the 1880s, 1890s, the synod, the local government, the central government, and also charitable institutions across the empire shovel money into church construction in the Baltic to try and make sure there is a quicker process of building churches for these new convert Estonian parishes. And when it comes to building these new churches, the government imposes a very particular style on the architecture of these new institutions. The so-called Russian national style, which was heavily favoured by Alexander III. The most famous example of this style is the Cathedral of the Spilt Blood in St. Petersburg, built on the spot of the assassination of Alexander II. This was the style being promoted especially in borderland regions like the Baltics, like Poland, like the Caucasus, and in Central Asia. If you live in Estonia, or you happen to visit Estonia, and you happen to go traveling around the countryside, you may be able to see churches built in this period using this very particular style, where essentially they adopt, if you know what St. Basil's, St. Vasilis on Red Square looks like, this style tries to adopt certain characteristics from this style. It tries to adopt Russian church architecture from before the the Westernizing reign of Peter the Great, because it was judged that these architectural styles were more authentically Russian than the sort of European-influenced architecture that came in the 18th century after Peter the Great's opening up to the West. And indeed, you can go and see one of these churches built in the Russian style in Tallinn, where the major Orthodox cathedral, that of St. Alexander Nevsky in Tallinn, is a church precisely built in this Russian national style. It was, the idea to build it belonged to Prince Tshovskoy, the governor of Estland. It cost an absolutely huge amount of money. I've given it here 550,000 rubles to build. And it was placed on one of the highest hills in Tallinn, which essentially was putting a Russian Orthodox cathedral built in this very obviously Russian national style on one of the highest hills in Tallinn. Well, it's an obvious marker of Russia's cultural, political, and economic dominance over the region. And of course, the name of the cathedral is also telling. Saint Alexander Nevsky was a medieval Russian prince who fought the German Baltic crusaders along in the Baltic provinces, defending the medieval kingdoms of Russia. Another way in which religious space was transformed under this in this period of Russification is through monastery construction. Basically, we mentioned in the beginning of this course, there was one monastery in the Baltic states by the end of the 17th, 18th century, the one in Yakupils. But by the middle of the 19th century, this had been closed and the early 19th century. By about the 1820s, I beg your pardon, this monastery had been closed, leaving very little in terms of a monastic presence. Now, for those of you who remember our lecture on monasteries and convents in the Russian Empire, monasticism was one of the defining characteristics of Russian Orthodoxy in the imperial period. And so its absence in the Baltic states was rather odd, rather peculiar, rather strange. It was also recognized by church leaders like Archbishop Ossieni, secular leaders like Konstantin Pobedonosov, Prince Tshovskoy, that monasteries and convents could be useful in selling the idea of Russian Orthodoxy itself, but also Russian culture, Russian language, to Estonian and Latvian peasants. So by the beginning of the 20th century, 4 monastic institutions, 3 convents, 1 monastery had been founded, 1 convent in Riga, 1 monastery in Riga, a convent in the Latvian town of Ilūkste, and a convent in the Estonian rural locality of Putitsa. With the exception of the monastery, the 3 convents provided social services alongside religious ones, precisely in order to attract Estonian and Latvian locals towards the example of Russian Orthodoxy, towards the example of Russian culture, offering free food, free medicine in hospitals and clinics, libraries, popular lectures, both in Estonian and Russian. And the libraries, at least in Putitsa, the library certainly had equal numbers of Estonian and Russian books, especially with schools that open to both Lutheran and Orthodox children. The idea was for these new monasteries, these new monastic institutions, were to be bastions of Russianness and Russian Orthodoxy in this new land, both defending the interests of those the Orthodox who existed already in the province, while also drawing in new potential converts from the local population. So there was also an effort to create new sacred stories, sacred ideas, sacred places in a previously non-Orthodox region, essentially to sacralize, even perhaps we may say orthodoxize the region by creating new narratives about local miracles, local icons, and potentially local saints. One of the most repeated sort of stories from this period is the semi-mythical story of Saint Isidore of Tartu and the 72 martyrs. Well, I say semi-mythical because I know some of my Estonian colleagues have put very great amount of doubt on the late 19th century Russian historical scholarship, which undergirds the notions of Isidore being a historical figure and of his saint's life of being historical events. But anyway, the legend went thus, that in Tartu, in the late 15th century, there was an Orthodox church with two priests, one of whom was Isidore. The local German Catholic bishop decided that he wanted everybody to convert to Catholicism, to abandon Orthodoxy. Isidore and 72 members of his flock, 72 parishioners, refused to convert to Russian Orthodoxy, for which it is alleged they were put to death by being drowned in Tartu's river, and therefore became martyrs for the Orthodox faith. And certainly the Church begins to put a lot of effort into promoting the cult of Saint Isidore. The Estonian the Estonian Orthodox parish in St. Petersburg, established at the end of the 1890s, is named after Saint Isidore. The Orthodox chapel in the University of Tartu, by the way, you can't see this today, of course, Tartu, but when they created the chapel in the university main building, they also installed a huge cupola on top of the building. But inside this chapel was a rather large icon of Saint Isidore, and certainly they started to encourage celebrations of Isidore's Saint's Day. There were a couple of other certain stories, certain sites, which could be sacralized and promoted as sites of local Orthodox holiness. So, for instance, there was the legend of the icon at Putitsa. The reason Putitsa was chosen as the site of a new Estonian Orthodox monastery convent was because it was alleged that at the end of the 16th century, a group of Estonian shepherds had seen a lady dressed in beautiful, radiant robes. Whenever they approached her, she vanished. And eventually, on the spot she was standing, they found an icon of the Virgin Mary. These Lutheran Estonian peasants didn't understand what it meant, so they gave it to their Russian-speaking, Orthodox-believing neighbors, who immediately identified it as an icon and believed that it was miraculous because of the image of the Virgin Mary that had been seen. And so it created a chapel at the site of Putitsa to protect that icon, and so that they could worship it in a proper atmosphere. As I'm going to show you in the next slide, this icon, this story is absolutely propagated and becomes a site of pilgrimage and worship in the region. Another one is the Jakobstadt icon of the Virgin Mary, Mother of God. There's a couple of stories associated with that. One is that a Swedish or a Saxon soldier, it depends on the telling which soldier it was, which nationality the soldier belonged to, was swimming across the river Daugava. As he swam, he saw a block of wood, which he pierced with his spear. And when he got out of the river, he noticed that blood was leaking down his spear. He looked up and saw that this block of wood was bleeding. He brought the block of wood down, saw it was an icon of the Virgin Mary, and on the spot decided to remain in Daugava, on the river Daugava, and build an Orthodox monastery in honor of this icon. Another miracle story tells that the icon's powers were discovered at the end of the 17th century when when it drove out a demon possessing a Latvian madman and thus cured him. But anyway, these are the kind of stories which are now being propagated by the Russian Orthodox Church to create the same kind of narratives, sites, and events that populated Orthodox religious life elsewhere in the empire. And indeed, events were created by these new holy sites, this new network of holy icons and monasteries and convents that had emerged in the Baltic states. And they were precisely facilitated by the new forms of modern transportation that were now dominating not only the Baltic states, but the Russian Empire as a whole. So, for instance, I've given you an example here that in 1900, the Yakapil's icon of the Virgin Mary was taken annually by a group of pilgrims by train from the Daugavpils all the way to Riga, and all the way north to Riga, and then south to Jelgava, the capital of Kurland province, and then then there was a cross procession from Jelgava to the Spaso-Prezenskaya hermitage by foot, and then finally the icon was returned to Jelgava by steamboat. And this was attracting about 1,000 people every year. And the state was certainly, well, of course, the Russian Orthodox Church sponsors this new pilgrimage, but the Russian state is also involved. The Ministry of Communications, for instance, gives both free and then discounted tickets to the very poorest pilgrims who want to take part in this new form of Baltic Orthodox religiosity. The Putitsa convent as well became the site of a pilgrimage. On the 15th of August every year, the celebration of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary was held. And this was the holy day of their icon. And we know from the records that this event gathered many, many thousands of people. Even during the years of the First World War, it's recorded about 8,000 people would attend these, would make a pilgrimage from across the region, from the Baltics, but also from Western Russia, from northwestern Russia, to attend the celebrations being held at Putitsa. And for those people who could not attend that particular pilgrimage, well, the convent also gave permission every year for the icon to make a trip around eastern Estland province, to go to Tallinn, go to Narva, Vasknava, and various other towns and villages in eastern Estland. This was, in some parts of the trip, when rivers were available, was done by steamboat, otherwise it was done by horse, and in some cases by train. Yes. So then the final part of our lecture then. So this is kind of the shape of orthodoxy by the beginning of the 20th century. A large convert population made up of Estonian and Latvian priests, increasingly served by Estonian and Latvian speaking clergy, with new religious buildings, new Orthodox buildings, new Orthodox narratives, new Orthodox institutions, creating a transformation in Baltic religious space into a much more orthodox region, a region of our local region of orthodox behaviors, beliefs, and practices. This continues in the 20th century, but is subject to changes because of events going on in the Russian Empire and beyond it. So in 1905, there is an attempted revolution, an attempt to bring down the Romanov regime. It survives, but has to make concessions. Now we're going to talk about the Russian Orthodox Church's reaction to the events of 1905 in a subsequent lecture. But allow me to say here that basically what happens is across the empire, local church, local priests, local church institutions begin to self-organize themselves, begin to meet together to try and discuss the problems not only of their local church communities, but also of the Russian Orthodox Church as a pan-imperial institution. And many of these new these congresses, assemblies, meetings, are seeking wide-scale changes to the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, Riga Diocese was no different, except for in one particular fact. Elsewhere across the empire, these meetings were being called things like congresses, assemblies, and so on and so forth. In Riga, they use a very particular word to describe their meeting. They call it a sabor, a council. And a sabor was technically one of the leading bodies collective bodies of Orthodoxy, not just in Russia, but elsewhere. By calling themselves a sabor, they were indicating two particular facts. The first one being that it wasn't just priests who were priests and monks attending these meetings, but also the laity. This indicated, so therefore using the term sabor, indicated a broader conception of who had the right to a voice in the church, who had a right to a say in how the church was administrated and how it would develop. And secondly, by using the term sabor, they are pinning their flag to the reformist camps within Russian Orthodox Church politics. These camps had long been demanding an imperial Russian sabor to reform the entirety of the Russian Orthodox Church. So therefore, this was a sign that the local Riga diocesan clergy and laity were siding with the reformist side in the church's internal politics. This stance in Riga would not have been possible without the reformist backing of the Bishop Agafangel Preobrazhensky, who was certainly one of the more, he wasn't a radical, but he was certainly one of the more far-reaching moderate reformers in church politics at the time. And certainly he absolutely sponsored the convention of this Riga Council, this Riga Sabor. Another noticeable fact is that for the first time, this is a meeting which is dominated not by Russian-speaking clergy, but by Estonian and Latvian-speaking clergy. 31 of the 46 priests represented in the council's meetings were Estonian and Latvians. Generally speaking, the national differences between the three groups, Estonian, Russian, and Latvian, were subsumed by their collective interests within the church and collective desire for church reforms. But nonetheless, this is a clear moment that the national minority clergies in the region are beginning to assert themselves and beginning to present their own distinct interests in public forums of the Orthodox Church. And basically, the reformist measures passed by this institution dominate local diocesan life up until 1914. Certainly not all of them are implemented, but the idea that they should be implemented, the idea that they pave a pathway forwards for the Orthodox Church in the Baltic region is always present in the vast majority of meetings held after 1905. It should be mentioned, just to make absolutely clear, at this current point, they are certainly not talking about founding, for instance, Estonian or Latvian national churches. And they're still happy to work within the framework of the Imperial Diocese of Riga, which operates under the aegis of the Russian Orthodox Church. The discussions about national churches comes much later, deeper into the crisis created by the First World War and the Russian Revolution. And indeed, the First World War is a tremendous crisis, not only for the Russian Empire, but for the Russian Orthodox Church, and particularly in borderland provinces like the Baltic and Poland, which are, of course, on the front line of the conflicts with the Germans. So initially, in August 1914, when the empire mobilizes to fight the German Empire and the Austrian Empire, the Orthodox Diocese of Riga follows the example of the Holy Synod, the example of many other Orthodox and non-Orthodox religious institutions across the empire, by mobilizing its charitable resources to take care of soldiers, wounded and sick soldiers, to take care of the widows and orphans of dead soldiers, and to also provide succor, to provide help for refugees. This could include, well, in some cases, some parishes directly established small hospitals, small clinics where wounded soldiers could be sent. But in other cases, they simply collected their money, sent it to buy things like medical equipment, beds, linens, bandages, clothing, food supplies, chocolate, cigarettes, which could either be used when given to soldiers if they were wounded, or could be sent directly to the front lines. However, this did not last. This situation lasted less than a year in Riga Diocese, because in the spring and summer of 1915, the German army launched a massive attack, a massive assault on the Russian Empire, breaking through the Russian front lines in the Baltic and in Poland, seizing a vast majority of the Russian Polish provinces, and seizing Kurland province and a good deal of southern Livland province. When the German advance stopped, they were only a few kilometers from the city of Riga, and which meant essentially that now Livland province was now a frontline region, frontline area in the struggle against the Germans. The church's response is basically to follow the orders of the state, is to evacuate its own personnel and its own property. So priests are ordered on the 19th of July 1915 to pack all of the valuables of their churches onto a train and retreat back into the Russian interior, where with any luck, they'd be able to provide some kind of social support for them. This means basically that in 1915, a large number of the vast majority of the clergy, the vast majority of the church's wealth in terms of icons, liturgical utensils, clothing, bells, etc., candle holders, all kinds of material are put onto trains and sent into Russia. And of course, after 1917, many of these never return, either seized by the Bolsheviks or used elsewhere. The administration itself evacuates from Riga, the diocesan administration evacuates from Riga. The bishop at the time, Johan Smirnov, goes to Tartu. The consistory administrators, the seminary, go to Nizhny Novgorod. The monasteries in Riga go to Novgorod, where they're given where the monks and nuns are given accommodation by the Archbishop of Novgorod in disused or small monastery buildings. So basically, Orthodoxy is very fully on the retreat. And then finally, in 1917, during the chaos caused by the Russian revolutions of that year, the German armies pushed through the disintegrating Russian armies and seized the rest of the Baltic provinces, finally capturing Tallinn on the 25th of February 1918. This now means that all of the Baltic Orthodox parishes, institutions, monasteries, convents, schools, etc., are under the control of the German army. And for the most part, from what our research has revealed, is that the German army was generally speaking respectful towards the local Orthodox priests who remained and to their local Orthodox churches. The problems came, it seems, not so much from the army, from the invading army itself, but rather from looting, other cases of petty theft, shortages of food, because the German army seized most of the food in the region to feed its own troops, and also from changed relationships with other confessions. So the invading German army was Lutheran, and what we find is that many of the Lutheran priests, at least as is reported by the Orthodox clergy, many of the Lutheran priests believe that things have now gone in their favor, that they are now the official religion with the support of the German state, and therefore they can sort of seize school buildings from Orthodox clergy, treat Orthodox clergy and Orthodox churches with disrespect, and so on and so forth. This is a generalized image of the invasion. Now I'd like to read actually a couple of letters written by, and this is going to be almost our conclusion, a couple of letters written by Estonian Orthodox priests going through this experience of conflict and this experience of military conflict and invasion in 1917 and 1918. So our first letter is from Father Alexander Kalas, who was on the island of Saaremaa during its invasion in 1917-1918. And his parish played host to a German army unit. And here is what he reported. I went to the church. It was full of straw. The candle cupboard had been broken and emptied. The candle holders in the chandelier had all been bent and the candles removed. Dressing gowns, overcoats, blankets, rags and candlesticks covered the floor. The beer had been turned into a dinner table. I went to the altar. Soldiers in hats cleaning their guns were all around it, as were straw, books, bloodied rags, empty cans and boxes of food. I went to the altar and bowed to the earth. I wanted to kiss it, but there was no room for this. It was covered in metal kettles, mugs and canteens. Bits of food, meat and bread were scattered around, along with cigar and cigarette butts. On top of all of this was a guitar. At this point, I began to cry. Hearing this, the German said, Vater. I looked. The cross and gospels and some other things were still there. But then I remembered about the collection tin and went to look. Everything was in place. I thanked the soldiers as far as I was able. In answer, I was told that they had not touched the church things. They asked me to take them away, which I did, putting them in the officer's room in my home. So here, of course, we see an instance where, although the German soldiers have occupied the Orthodox Church and have certainly set up camp inside it, they certainly haven't directly committed any acts of sacrilege against this church property, and they are certainly not insulting or offending, insulting or attacking the Estonian Orthodox priest when he goes to inspect his property. And now we have here an account of battle by Father R, again on the island of Saaremaa. I lived through 4 terrible days between the 30th September and the 3rd October. These were the days of the battle, if one can call it that, between the Germans and the Russians. Machine guns constantly rattled, cannon shells flew, shaking the window glass, planes and zeppelins fluttered overhead, and explosions and searchlights unceasingly lit up the area. Here was the terrible picture of war, previously unseen and unheard by the peaceful residents. It struck fear in them. But thank God we survived these days, terrible in terms of noise and sight. After this, Kaiser Wilhelm's men in grey showed themselves. The 1st Regiment stayed at our church on the 2nd of October. The officers ordered that I open the church door, but when I went for the keys, the soldiers broke it down. In the church itself, I did not note anything sacrilegious. At my request, they did not enter the altar. The soldiers had already broken into the hayloft and pulled out 100 poods of hay for the horses. They walked around the vicarage looking for Russians and grabbed whatever fell into their hands. So again, we see, firstly, I think the sheer terror that these priests went through as the war came to their very doorsteps, but also that even though the churches and their persons often weren't touched by the occupying armies, certainly these German armies did seize food and other materials that they deemed necessary for their war effort. So finally then, we come to what is really the collapse of Riga Diocese and the transformation of Baltic Orthodoxy into something entirely new. When the Romanov monarchy collapsed in 1917, anarchy both in the civil government and in the church government took over, making it very difficult for anybody in the synod to ensure instructions are passed down. Basically, authority begins to pass to local church institutions, which certainly started to form in the Baltic states. The local clergy in the Baltic formed an assembly where they demanded the division of Riga Diocese into 2 new dioceses, one for Estonian speakers and one for Latvian speakers, and of course to be headed now by an Estonian speaking and a Latvian speaking bishops. They were partially able to do this because the Archbishop of Riga, Johan Smirnov, returned to Russia to attend the local church council in July-August 1917, and when he did so, he was essentially unable to return. The next revolution in October-November 1917, and the outbreak of civil war at the end of 1917-1918, along with the independence conflicts ongoing in Estonia and Latvia, prevented his return. He eventually, in November 1917, he essentially asked for a transfer to a different diocese. This meant that there was a position to be filled. And so, for the first time, the Baltic clergy elected their own bishop. Such elections were going on in many dioceses of the Russian Empire. And in the case of the Baltics, they chose an Estonian, the priest Platon Kubush. Platon had been taught at Riga Seminary, where he had graduated with the highest grades. He had gone to the St. Petersburg Ecclesiastical Academy. Then he had served as the priest of the Estonian Orthodox parish in St. Petersburg, the parish of St. Isidore. The only sort of thing blocking Platon's accession to the episcopate was the fact that he had technically not got divorced. He was estranged from his wife, which meant there had to be a very rapid formal divorce proceeding in the synod before he was able to be consecrated as the new bishop of Riga. And therefore, he was the first Estonian-speaking Bishop of Riga. He also happened to be the last. He inherited an extraordinarily difficult situation, having to travel around the diocese full of conflict, full of soldiers, full of infrastructure breakdowns. Nonetheless, he did manage to visit an extremely large number of parishes, 70 in less than a year, despite, all these terrible conditions blocking his way. In some cases, he did receive some assistance from the German army, which was eager to sort of support the maintenance of civil order in the region. But finally, during one of his travels, he became sick and had to stay in Tartu. And unfortunately, that was a very unfortunate illness, because while he was lying sick in Tartu at the end of December, the Bolsheviks seized the city of Tartu. And before they were thrown out, they arrested Bishop Platon, along with a number of leading religious figures, 2 Orthodox priests and 1 Lutheran priest. Rather than let their prisoners go free or leave them to the invading Estonian independence army, the Bolsheviks instead murdered Bishop Platon, the 2 Orthodox priests, the Lutheran priests, and others in the basements of the building they were being kept. They were all shot in the head. Essentially then, the death of Bishop Platon, who has subsequently become a martyr in both the Estonian Apostolic Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, essentially ended the existence of the Imperial Diocese of Riga. In the next year, after the next years of chaos, fighting, and communications breakdown, what emerged were 2 new independent national Orthodox churches in the Baltic, the Latvian Orthodox Church and the Estonian Apostolic Orthodox Church, both of which had complicated relationships with Moscow, but that is a story for another time. So then, to conclude our lecture for today, the Orthodoxy in the Baltic provinces was profoundly transformed in the imperial period. It transformed from a community of, from a religion of settlers, mostly with most of its churches based in cities and on the borderlands of Russian majority provinces. It changed from this status into a much more dynamic and much more widespread phenomenon. It spread beyond the Russian-speaking people in the Baltic provinces to the Latvian and Estonian-speaking peoples, and in the process becoming a very substantial minority, a minority that also happened to enjoy the prestige and privileges of being the members of the state religion. The period of Russification in the 1880s, 1890s led to further transformations, not just simply in the number of parishes and in church instruction, but also in populating the Baltic provinces with a number of new sacred narratives, sacred sites, sacred institutions, which were meant to mark the Baltic provinces as a naturally Orthodox place, a naturally Orthodox religious locality. Now, although World War I, the revolutions effectively destroyed the imperial diocese, the transformations that had been going on since the 1830s and 1840s really provided the substantial basis for the national churches that came to follow. and still provides the bases for those national churches in the modern-day republics of Estonia and Latvia. And I think with that we will conclude. So I thank you for your attention, and I hope to see you in our next lecture.